Hello, my name is Dr. Eleanor Ratcliffe, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in environmental psychology here in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Tampere. And I'm going to talk in this lecture about how our perceptions of restorative environments, so how we experience them with our senses, and also what these environments mean to us, so their associative values. And in this lecture, I'm continuing from the literature discussed by my colleague Calabi Korpela. And so in listening to this lecture, I'm assuming that you have a basic knowledge of restorative environments and theories such as attention restoration and stress recovery theory. So before I go any further, I'm going to say a few words about what I mean by perceiving a restorative environment and also what I mean by evaluating it. So when I talk about perception of an environment, I mean the way we process an environment with our senses, so the things we see and hear and smell and maybe taste and touch in an environment. And this is all coming under the umbrella of bottom-up processing, so the different physical or sensory aspects of an environment that we collect with our senses and evaluate based on the information in the environment itself. When I talk about top-down processing, this is what I mean by evaluating the environment. So based on that kind of bottom-up sensory information, we evaluate it based on our existing associations and knowledge of the environment, what the environment means to us and what we expect from it. And this is very much a cognitive and what we call affective or emotional approach, evaluating the information in the environment according to our existing thoughts and feelings. When I talk about the first kind of perception, I'm going to focus primarily on vision, because vision is of course one of the most important and the primary ways in which we understand the world around us. And it so happens that a lot of the evidence for restorative environments is quite visually focused. A lot of the experiments which show that natural environments can be restorative kinds of environments, these experiments use photographs or films of natural environments, and they often do that in place of direct experience because it happens to be easier to use photographs in a controlled laboratory environment, photographs or films or other kinds of slideshow materials. And so there are a number of studies dating back several decades now which show that people can restore their attentional capacity and also recover from stress to a better extent when they view pictures or other visual media of natural environments. So that kind of outcome is more positive in response to natural environments than it is in response to urban or built environments. And so you can see the kinds of environments that I'm talking about in the photographs here. So on the top level you can see these non-threatening, maybe not incredibly spectacular kind of natural vistas of rolling hills, trees, greenery and water. And underneath you can see these kind of average, not particularly beautiful or stunning urban environments as well, streets and concrete and buildings. And so these studies show that when people view these kinds of pictures of natural environments for anywhere between 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, they can recover from stress or attentional fatigue better than if they look at the urban environments. So, for example, in 2005, an Italian researcher called Rita Berto found that after inducing a state of attention fatigue in her participants by getting them to do this 5-minute computer task, we call it the sustained attention to response task. That involves people pressing a lot of buttons on a computer but withholding their response to a particular kind of stimulus. Once people had done that task and sustained a certain amount of attentional fatigue, they were then exposed to pictures of natural environments or pictures of urban environments, and the participants who viewed the natural environments did better on the same computer task afterwards than the participants who viewed the urban environment. And this is quite a standard kind of response in these restoration paradigms. So when participants tend to look at these urban environments, they either show a very small positive change in their attentional performance, or perhaps no change, or sometimes even a negative change. They do worse on the task, or they perform more slowly than participants who have seen the natural environments. And these kinds of restorative outcomes are not limited just to attention. They are also displayed in terms of how stressed people feel, how physically aroused, and how positive versus how negative they feel. So, for example, in one of Roger Ulrich's studies with his colleagues in 1991, he found a way to make his participants feel negative and stressed at the start of an experiment. So they viewed an upsetting video. And then they were then asked to view a video of a natural environment, which also happened to include some sounds, or they viewed an urban environment, again with sounds of traffic and so forth. When participants viewed the natural environment, they were quicker to recover from this state of negative affect and stress. So their physiological arousal, their heart rate came down, and this was a faster recovery from stress and more complete than participants who viewed the urban environment. So based on these kinds of studies, we can see that at least when people are viewing visual media, or predominantly visual media, of natural environments, that seems to help them recover from states of fatigue and stress better and more quickly than people who view urban environments. And so when we think about reasons why these kinds of results might occur, we can start to look a little more at the theory behind restorative environments, which is something that Calavi discussed in his lecture as well. I want to think about why visual environments might help people to recover their attention if they've been tired or fatigued, and why these kinds of visual natural environments might also help people to recover from stress and feel more positive if they've been through a stressful or negative experience. And so I think the first thing to consider here is what we call aesthetic properties of natural environments. So how they are structured, the way they are formed, and these kinds of visual properties that make up natural environments. And if we think about attention restoration theory developed by the Kaplans in the late 1980s, there are two properties here that really stand out in terms of their relationship with the aesthetic properties of nature, the way nature is visually structured. And these two are fascination and also the coherence of natural environments, their visual coherence. So fascination is defined by the Kaplans as this process of having one's attention non-dramatically captured by aspects of restorative and particularly natural restorative environments. So the Kaplans suggest that this kind of fascination is engaged by patterns in nature, so things like leaves moving in the breeze, the movement of water, things like sunsets and gentle vistas. So elements of nature that people can use to engage their attention, but it doesn't require all of their attention. It still gives people room to reflect on their issues and to escape problems in their daily life. So it's a moderate sort of cognitive or attentional engagement. And this seems to make intuitive sense because a lot of these patterns in nature, if you think about one's own experience in natural environments, these things are quite captivating. It's pleasant and interesting to look at the way leaves move. They form interesting patterns, like you can see in this photograph here on the right, of the shadows cast by the sun on some leaves. But it's not a very structured definition, I suppose, would be my criticism of this aspect of the theory. It's very hard to define exactly what is fascinating and what isn't, and it's further complicated by the fact that the Kaplans divide fascination into something called hard fascination, which is a kind of very captivating attentional experience. So that might be something like watching an animal attack or some kind of violence, something that really captures your attention and you can't look away, versus a soft form of fascination. So this is more in line with this idea of leaves moving in the breeze, something that is non-threatening and not too engaging, still gives you this room for reflection. And so I start to wonder what exactly it is that we mean by fascination, and I return more to this idea of pattern. Is it less about this idea of how captivating something is and soft versus hard, and is it more about the ease with which we can think about these patterns and process them in our mind? And this brings me also to ideas of complexity and structure, which are elaborated on a bit further in stress recovery theory by Roger Ulrich, again in the 1980s. And so his suggestion was that our positive evaluations of natural environments, and furthermore how restorative we think those environments will be, can be aided by environments that are complex, so they give us enough to focus on, enough to enjoy in an environment. A complex environment is likely to be one that offers us resources as well, and might be good for us, good for human beings and their survival. But this complexity also ought to be structured in some kind of understandable way in order to be pleasant for people and useful for people as well. So complexity on its own merit is perhaps not so valuable, but complexity within structure and order is suggested to be quite useful and positive and pleasant for individuals in nature. And together these ideas seem to match this idea of coherence also put forward by the Kaplans. So this idea that an environment needs to be sensible and easy for people to find their way around in, needs to have some kind of structure again, so that people aren't expending attentional resources trying to understand what is going on in the environment. So even though there are different kinds of terminology or phrasing in these theories, fascination, coherence, complexity, structure, there seems to be an underlying theme of having enough to do and enjoy and think about in nature, but having it structured in such a way that it is not chaotic, it's not overwhelming. There is a definite pattern, structure, or order. And so this brings me to perhaps more recent development in the theory of how visual natural environments can be of benefit to us. And it's perhaps not so much a theory in itself, but more an approach, an interpretation. It's called the processing fluency account, put forward by Yannick Yoye and colleagues in 2011. And this processing fluency account suggests that certain visual natural environments can be helpful or restorative for people because of the way they allow easy processing in our mind. So it's more restorative for us if we can focus on an environment that doesn't take much effort to understand. So perhaps this is a more comprehensive view of these sort of concepts like complexity and structure that I have put forward just now. So if something is fluently processed, it doesn't take much attentional resource, and therefore people are more likely to be restored when they view it. And one of the concepts that's related in this idea of processing fluency is that a lot of nature is actually kind of fractal or self-similar in its nature. So if we look at things like leaves and plants and trees, very often they display a self-similarity in their structure. And by that I mean the shape of the whole is very often formed of repetitions of the smallest element. So if you think about the shape of a tree is formed by the recurrence or repeating of its branches over and over in different directions. Or if you look at a leaf, the shape of a leaf forms the shape of a plant. There are many leaves that come together to make up the shape of a plant as a whole. And you can see this in certain plants in particular, like ferns or this leaf on the right here, how a simple shape repeated many times over provides a certain level of complexity in an environment. And as we know, people find environments that have a certain level of complexity pleasant or desirable, but the self-similarity of this complexity means that it's easy to process, because no matter how much is going on in the visual scene that you're looking at, you know it's just a compilation of the same kind of shape repeated over and over again. So the complexity has predictable, understandable structure. And these kinds of fractal shapes in nature have been linked to evaluations of pleasantness and desirability, so by Carolyn Hagerhall and colleagues in 2004. So if we're thinking purely about the visual aspects of how we perceive natural environments as restorative, it seems that perhaps this idea of pattern and fractality is quite important, the idea of giving people enough to stimulate themselves, to take their minds off whatever might be troubling with them, but doing so within a framework of pattern, order and structure that means it's not overwhelming. So in the last section we focused very much on vision and visual experience of natural environments, but I want to move on now to talk about sounds, because also we don't just experience nature through vision but also through different kinds of senses, and for many people sound is a very important part of natural environments. So as Mason colleagues mentioned in 2004, things like the wind rustling through the leaves, water sounds like a babbling brook or a thundering waterfall, and also animal sounds like birds and other wildlife. These are all part of experiencing and appreciating nature. And I think it's very important that we discuss these kinds of different sensory aspects, because of course for many people vision is not accessible. So for example, people with visual impairments, or perhaps people who live in urban environments and can't see nature but still might be exposed to other sensory experiences like sounds in the outside world around them. And in thinking about this, it's fair to say that the experience of natural sounds and natural soundscapes as restorative has received relatively little attention. There's a growing body of evidence from the last decade or so which shows that natural sounds can be perceived and also experienced as restorative, or offering benefits to people after stress and fatigue. But still, most of the evidence for this comes from qualitative work, and by that I mean interviews with people asking how they feel about sounds and different sensory aspects in nature. So this was really the focus of my PhD work, which I did and completed last year in 2015, and my work focused on the experiences of bird sounds as restorative for people. So as part of this, I conducted a set of interviews with members of the public to understand to what extent different sensory experiences played a part in their restorative experiences of nature, and to what extent sounds were important in that as well. And I found out that birds were the kind of natural sound that people most associated with natural environments, along with wind and water and interacting with nature kind of sounds like walking around on the grass. This participant, she said, I just like the sound of birds singing. It makes me feel happy, I suppose. So there's this link between bird sounds and other kinds of wildlife sounds and this feeling of positive emotion. And a researcher called Curtin in 2009, she was interviewing a group of wildlife tourists in America. So these were people who, of course, had a specific interest in nature and wildlife. They weren't just perhaps people with an average interest in the world around them. They were experts or people who were really committed to this kind of occupation. But these people seem to display positive attitudes towards hearing sounds from nature and a change in their mood, a change from a negative state to a more positive state. So this participant said, when you've not been sleeping and you wake up very early and you hear the dawn chorus and you hear the birds, you could suddenly in seconds feel uplifted, and you think, well, there's nothing really to be depressed about because life's quite good, really. So there's this link here between the sounds of birds, for example, and a state of moving from negative to positive affect, and of life being good, of all being well with the world, a state of peace, for example. And again, we see from some more recent research from last year that there is this link between experience of restorative environments and consideration of who is experiencing these environments. Is it a person for whom vision is not accessible? So this work by Shaw and colleagues last year, she was interviewing individuals with visual impairment. So for them, seeing nature was not an accessible sensory modality. And it seemed that sound and hearing was instead the most important sensory modality. this participant said, hearing would predetermine most of my mood and my positive mood to the environment I was in, because that's the thing that gives me most feedback. Smell was much more localized. So this participant was talking about the positives and negatives of different sensory aspects. And sound gave them a lot of information about the world around them. It helped to define the environment that they were in and had knock-on effects on their mood, so making them feel positive and happy and so forth. So if we move on from qualitative work to thinking about how exposure to natural sounds can have effects on people if they've been stressed, now we can start to think about these kinds of laboratory studies that mirror the work that's been done with visual exposure to natural environments. So there have been a number of experimental studies or lab-based studies over the last few years which have found that if people are made to be stressed or feel negative at the start of an experiment and then exposed to sounds from nature, so from the case of Jesper Alverson and colleagues in 2010, participants were asked to do a lot of frustrating computer-based tasks and then asked to listen to sounds from nature, so running water and bird sounds mixed together, versus sounds from the built environment, so it was sort of industrial noises of a building and a generator. It turns out that participants who had been stressed prior to the sound exposure and then listened to the natural sounds recovered from the stress faster in terms of how their skin was conducted, so how conductive their skin was, how sweaty they were. They recovered faster when they were listening to the natural sounds as opposed to the urban sounds, which didn't help stress recovery quite so quickly or completely. And similarly, Jacob Benfield and colleagues in 2014 found that when participants were made to feel stressed and negative through a video designed to negatively affect their mood, when those participants were exposed to similar sounds from nature, so birds and water versus traffic sounds, the participants who heard the natural sounds experienced a more full recovery of their mood state. They felt more positive after the stressor and the restorative experience of sounds than participants who listened to the traffic sounds. They didn't experience that same level of recovery of their mood. So here we can see these similar kinds of restorative effects from natural sounds as we found in the visual studies. But this is very much in response to stress recovery, so helping people to recover from a stressful experience where they might feel more physiologically aroused, so higher heart rate, more sweaty, conductive skin, and also restoring people's mood after this kind of negative, stressful experience. But what we aren't really seeing so much is these kinds of positive effects on people's cognition and their attention restoration. Studies on that are still rather limited and not showing that much in the way of positive results or effects. But perhaps in a way this also mirrors studies that we have seen with visual exposure to natural environments, in that it's not always clear cut what kind of attention might be being restored by natural environments, and whether we're using the right measures, whether it's a consistent effect, how long it takes, how long people should be exposed to nature for that kind of effect to happen. So while we're seeing quite strong effects of stress recovery, natural vision and natural sounds helping people to recover from stress, I think the evidence for attention restoration is perhaps a little less clear, and certainly in respect to natural sounds, I think the evidence is just not there yet that natural sounds on their own can help people to recover from attention fatigue, if you like, or cognitively demanding tasks. But certainly in terms of stress recovery and rating how people feel, their mood in themselves, it seems that natural sounds can have a similar kind of restorative effect as to natural vision or visual experience of nature. And if we move on from thinking about just vision on its own to how, or just audio on its own as well, to thinking about how these two sensory modalities interact, we can also see that audio has quite a supportive and helpful effect on our visual experience. So going back all the way to 1983, Anderson and colleagues found that if you add sounds of nature to visual stimuli of a natural environment, so pictures, for example, photographs, if the sounds that are added to those photographs are congruent, if they match what is going on in the visual scene, then perception and desirability of that scene is enhanced. So people would rate a natural environment as pleasant, but even more pleasant if expected natural sounds like birds or wind and water were added to those pictures. Whereas if the sounds were incongruent, if they didn't agree with what was going on in the picture, so for example there was a picture of a natural environment supplied with traffic sounds or other sounds from the built environment, then the rating of that environment was pleasant would go down. It wouldn't be perceived to be as pleasant as before. And so I think this shows the importance of making sure the audio or the sounds and the visual experience are in line with each other in order not to surprise people or confound their expectations about what a natural environment should be like, both in terms of how it sounds and how it looks. And I've talked a bit about bird sounds in the context of natural sounds and soundscapes, but I also thought it was worth mentioning that not all birds sound the same, and indeed not all natural sounds sound the same. Not all natural environments look the same. So I think we have to be careful about generalizing too much when we talk about natural environments or natural soundscapes as positive. And going back to 1985, a Finnish researcher called Erkki Björk realized and did some laboratory experiments on this as well, that of course different bird sounds have different acoustic properties. Some are more raucous, louder, and more high-pitched or low-pitched than others. And this corresponds to different kinds of perceptions and evaluations by individuals as well. So songbirds are quite positively evaluated. This is what he found in his research in 1985, whereas birds that make squawking or raucous noises are less positively evaluated. And in my own research as well, I found similar kinds of results. So whilst people have very positive evaluations of songbirds and birds that make beautiful or otherwise aesthetically pleasing sounds, birds that make more raucous, loud, noisy sounds like magpies, crows, these kinds of animals have more negative associations and are not seen to make such pleasant sounds. And people were indeed saying in the studies that I did that they wouldn't find listening to those kinds of birds restorative because of the kind of ugly or undesirable sounds they were making. So well, even though we can say that perhaps certain natural sounds help people to recover from negative states, I think it's important not to overgeneralize and to reflect on the fact that different kinds of natural environments have different properties, and particularly when we start to think about birds and other specific aspects of nature as well, it pays to pay close attention to exactly what is going on in the soundscape or in the visual scene. What is it that this animal or this other element of nature is communicating to people, and are they going to like it? And so we've covered a fair amount of the evidence for experience of natural sounds and perceptions of natural sounds as potentially restorative. But it's perhaps time to think about the theoretical basis for why this might be, because the prevailing theories that we have in this field of restorative environments are quite visually focused. So both attention restoration theory and stress recovery theory draw from visual experience of natural environments, and they talk about the visual properties of those environments as well. So how complex they are, how patterned, what kind of fascination they offer, and also the processing fluency account as well is thinking mostly about visual properties that might aid fluency of processing of environments, and not so much about the acoustic properties that might aid that as well. So in thinking, particularly in my PhD work as well, about why sounds might be restorative, I started to wonder if there might be acoustic parallels to these visual properties. You know, if a visual environment can be complex but patterned, can acoustic environments also be like that? And what about specific sounds? Of course, you know, sounds have their own frequency or pitch, but they're also made up of information. That information can be complex, it can have a lot of different elements. but it can also be structured in a certain way, pattern versus random. So it seems like there might be intuitive parallels between these visual properties that we've talked about before and also these acoustic properties. And indeed, when I was doing my doctoral research, that's what I found in the context of bird sounds, that certain properties of these bird sounds, like how complex but also how patterned they are, were predictive of how restorative people thought those sounds would be. And also if the sounds were quiet and if they had a certain association with them, positive associations as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is something that's not really been incorporated into the theoretical framework as such, but perhaps it's time that researchers started to think about this, because of course, as I've mentioned, not everyone experiences environments, and especially natural environments, through vision alone. There's always sound involved. If you're in the direct experience out in the field, you hear nature as well as see it. So even though the theories as they stand perhaps don't focus on sound so much, I think there's certainly room for those theories to do that. And I think part of the issue why the theoretical frameworks don't involve sound so much is that there is actually relatively little research on why certain sounds are pleasant for people rather than unpleasant, because there is certainly a lot of research on why we dislike certain sounds, why we dislike sounds of a moderate frequency, which perhaps is related to the prevalence of distress sounds, so crying babies or wounded or aggressive animals making calls in specific frequency ranges, and perhaps certain sounds that we find unpleasant might remind us of that. That is a theory that's perhaps been put forward by researchers such as Kumar. So this idea of the acoustic properties of a sound symbolizing something about what the sound means, and perhaps in particular that it might be a negative or dangerous kind of sound. And researchers such as Andriga and Lancer go further, and they suggest that soundscapes which possess these kinds of chaotic or certain acoustic properties, like different pitches, certain pitches within a certain frequency range, they too can symbolize threat. And this is why perhaps we don't like chaotic kind of soundscapes that have alarm calls in them. They symbolize that something negative is going on in the environment. But you can see here that a lot of these theories are quite focused on the negative, so associations between different sounds and threat, what kind of warning or alarm sounds, whether it's symbolizing that some creature or person is in pain, versus whether there's some kind of aggressive act going on in the environment. And there's really rather little emphasis on why certain sounds are considered pleasant, or at least not unpleasant. Why do we like and find relaxing or restorative these kinds of sounds but not other kinds of sounds? So I think before the theoretical frameworks on restorative environments can accommodate sounds and soundscapes to a greater extent, we need more research on the kinds of sounds that people like or don't like and why that might be, and then we can start to build that in to the theories of restorative environments. But something we do know is that the presence of natural sound is very much linked with perceptions of tranquility and serenity and biodiversity in natural environments. So this is stemming from leisure and tourist studies, so trying to understand what draws people to spend time in natural environments. And it seems like people link the presence of bird sounds or other natural sounds and the absence of sounds from the built environment with these ideas of being at peace, being in a tranquil environment that is away. Again, this concept of being away, perhaps linking with attention restoration theory. So these sounds are all linked with ideas of being in an untouched environment. And also this idea of biodiversity. If you can hear wildlife around you, it suggests that the environment is flourishing. There is a lot of life, particularly animal life there. And it could be that these are also linked with concepts of adaptive environments that are good for us to be in, because there is a sense of vitality and life in environments where there is a lot of animal life making a noise and contributing to the soundscape that we hear. And in thinking about biodiversity, it also brings me to this idea of bonds between people and animals, because in my research on people's experiences of bird sounds as restorative. Quite often people were saying to me that it was not just the act of listening to birds that it was important, but also having some kind of interaction with the birds, feeding them or watching them, enjoying them, and being somehow socially engaged with the animal life in the natural environment around them. And this link between people and animals is also something that's been not so well explored, I think, in restorative environments. Very often, for the sake of being controlled and trying to conduct a rigorous laboratory experiment, we exclude things like animals and people from scenes of natural environments. But of course, animals are very much a part of nature, and I think it makes a lot of sense if we try and understand to what extent this link between people and animals and the bonds that people have with animals might be a part of their restorative experiences of nature and not some separate field. Certainly that's what I was finding in my doctoral research, that people really seem to get a lot of emotional value and draw comfort and strength from their relationships with animals, and perhaps having surprise encounters with animals in the wild as well. So I think there certainly deserves to be more research on the potential benefits that people can draw, not just from visual scenes of greenery and blue space, water in nature, but also the animals that inhabit that space as well. So I'm going to continue from here talking about other kinds of senses when we think about environmental perception and how we experience environments in a bottom-up, sensory and perceptual kind of way. And I've spoken about vision and about sound, but of course we have other sensory experiences as well. So I'm thinking in particular of touch and smell. And just in the way that sound has up until rather recently received relatively little research in the field of restorative environments, there is still indeed even less research on how touch and smell and even taste can affect people's restorative experiences or generate restoration in themselves. So it's still a very under-researched area. But what we do know about these kinds of senses comes from, again, qualitative research, so interviews and discussions with participants about how they feel about sensory experiences in nature. So in their 2010 study, Fjellgren and Burkall again talk about how participants say, all the sounds and smells and light make me calm. And Shaw and colleagues in 2015, when they were conducting their interviews with partially sighted or visually impaired people, participants were saying the smells of just things like the smell of grass, that lovely earthy smell that you get when it's been raining. So this participant was referring to petrichor, or the smell of the earth after rain and when different smells are released from the ground. And it seems that participants are evaluating these kinds of smells and different sensory experiences, sound, lighting and so forth. They're being evaluated as positive and calming, pleasant. But here again we notice that this evidence is qualitative, so it's not experimental. It's not showing that there is an objective restorative effect of these kinds of sensory experiences, but rather that participants themselves think they are part of their beneficial experiences of nature. But as restorative virtual environments become more advanced and developed, researchers are showing an interest in trying to incorporate these kinds of multisensory experiences into experiences and perceptions of restorative environments. So Knight and colleagues in 2012 were conducting some preliminary studies on whether virtual environments could be restorative, and as part of that they were looking mostly at sounds, but also trying to understand the methodology required to include things like touch, smell in those restorative virtual environments as well. But I think it's fair to say that this is still a very understudied topic, and we don't know if smell has a restorative effect. And indeed, I think there are a number of issues to consider in this topic, particularly because of certain individuals' sensitivity to things like smell. So whereas sounds and vision are things that perhaps people can escape to a certain extent, if you don't like a sight that you are seeing, you can close your eyes. With the sound, it's perhaps a little harder. But with smell, it's actually quite difficult to escape it if you don't like it. Smell persists in the space quite strongly. And if you have an allergic experience or some other kind of unpleasant reaction, that could actually be quite problematic for people. This is something we were discussing recently in a conference last summer, and how one might deal with that in a restorative setting. So I think it pays to consider that although other sensory experiences like smell definitely deserve more research and might deserve to be included in restorative environments, we need to be careful about to whom these kinds of sensory experiences might be administered and who might benefit from them. Do people want them to be there in the first place? So even though, as I mentioned, there's still relatively little research on different kinds of multisensory experiences like touch and smell and how they relate to restorative environments, that's not to say that they're not very much a part of restorative environments in an applied sense. So by that I mean actual places where people go to receive restorative benefits, such as healing gardens. And these can be places where people might go if they're in recovery from physical or mental ill health, places where they can visit but also be an active participant. So, for example, healing gardens in rehabilitation centres, and also there's been a rise in the use of green or ecotherapy as a way to help people recovering from mental illness or other forms of illness. So it's part of their rehabilitation process to be in nature and use the garden as a method of conducting work and getting back into the habit of being physically active. So as part of these healing gardens and other such settings, touch and smell are very much a part of the kind of multisensory experiences that one receives in those settings. So I have here a quote from Stigsdotter and Gran in their paper on healing gardens in 2002, where they say a garden, and particularly an institutional garden, so that could be somewhere like a hospital, a garden may be regarded as a very special form of applied art, able to offer the visitor a rich variety of experiences, since in a garden all of the senses of man are activated. To have a complete idea of a garden, one has to be in it, to feel the irregularities of the ground under one's feet, see and hear and rejoice at the tender blossoms of the witch hazel in the middle of winter, smell the sweet odour of the rose, hear the singing of the wind in the poplars, and feel the wind in one's hair. So here they're talking about the importance of the multisensory and holistic environmental experience that is part of a healing garden. So it's not just vision or just hearing something, it's the complete picture, the complete environment produced by these different senses coming together to form a whole entire experience. And so I think this shows that even though the empirical and academic research is still rather lacking on how touch and smell individually contribute to restorative experiences, we can see from both studies involving field or outdoor direct experiences of nature and also these applied settings, so healing gardens away from experimental settings, we can see that multisensory experiences like touch and smell, hearing, vision, maybe even taste, these things are all an integral part of directly experiencing nature. And just because the research and the empirical evidence isn't there yet on how much or to what extent these senses individually impact on restorative experiences in nature, I think it still is important to bear in mind that they are very much a part of nature and are worthy of inclusion in designing for restorative environments as well. And indeed, if we think beyond outdoor settings like healing gardens, it's fair to say that sensory aspects like sound, maybe even smell and touch as well, these are all parts of installations or art projects that have become quite popular in built settings as well. So artists and designers trying to bring elements of nature into the built environment inside buildings, or playing with the idea of the indoors versus the outdoors. So for example, in 2012 in the USA, Cornell University installed a garden space inside one of their libraries. So they had turf and other kinds of greenery settings, toys, plants, and it was designed to help students feel more relaxed and feel calm around exam time as they were preparing for stressful exams. And even though the empirical evidence of these kinds of effects is lacking, I think it shows that people are trying to bring elements of nature that we know to be beneficial for people, they're trying to bring them into the built environment. And very often, although they can have positive effects for people, very often these are perhaps part of some kind of marketing or other kinds of corporate identity work or projects as well. So for example, in the United Kingdom, there's been a popular move to play birdsong in service stations, gas stations, on motorways, in airports, and other kinds of perhaps unexpected built environments where you might not think, oh, why is there a bird singing in here? Or why am I seeing this tree or this green space inside? So for a local example as well, in Helsinki airport, there is a sort of relaxation reading room, which happens to have a lot of wooden furniture and wallpaper depicting green and natural environments. It has soft carpets, soft green carpets, designed to look a bit like grass. Everything is very soft to the touch, lots of natural materials, warm, not cold metal or plastic. So in that kind of way, they're playing with the idea of natural environments and bringing elements of nature that people enjoy and find comforting in some way, bringing them into the built environment. So I think based on this, we can see that there's definitely a lot of development in applied settings for the principles of restorative environments. And very often these applied settings are using these different and lesser studied sensory aspects like touch and smell, the feeling of different materials. This is something that's also being studied at Aalto University at the moment, awaiting results. So I think we can see that the lead is being taken perhaps in an applied setting where we're advancing in use of these different sensory aspects, and now it's time for academic research to catch up with that a little bit and try and examine why and exactly how and for whom these different sensory aspects of nature experiences can be beneficial. So in the first part of this lecture, I've covered information about bottom-up processing, and by that I mean the way we perceive restorative environments with our senses: vision, sound, smell, taste, and touch. In the next part of the lecture, I'm going to talk more about associations and meanings, the top-down processing of restorative environments, so the way we interpret them according to what we already know and believe and remember about environments. But I wanted to bridge the two parts of the lecture by talking about the links between bottom-up and top-down processing. And I think part of this is the importance of memory, because when we perceive things in our environment, so we see them, but maybe also things we hear or smell or taste, it can be that those sensory experiences summon past associations, memories of the past, things we have experienced before. So I think a perfect example of this is Marcel Proust and his writing on madeleines, or these little small cakes. And his writing is about all the memories that have been conjured up when he smelt and ate those little cakes. This is quite a famous piece of writing of his. And so he writes, "The smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls, ready to remind us, waiting and hoping for their moment, amidst the ruins of all the rest, and bear unfaltering in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence, the vast structure of recollection." So what Proust is saying here is that the different sensory experiences of things in our environment are a sort of vessel for the memories we have about our past experiences and things that have happened to us in the context of the sensory experiences we're having now. So in eating these little cakes, he was reminded of the past times he'd eaten them as a child. And in the same way, I think we can apply that understanding to restorative environments too. And this is something that researchers I've started to consider in the context of memories of place and how our experience of place in the present moment can cause us to reflect on experiences in place that we've had in the past. So our experience now could be coloured by how happy or sad, how calm or how stressed we felt in that environment or a similar environment in the past. And there's still kind of a new link, a new area of research, I think, for restorative environments, which so far has remained very much focused on this idea of bottom-up processing and the sensory aspects, not so much on the associative aspects. So in the second part of this lecture, I'm going to talk more about these associations, but I first wanted to draw this link between the sensory experiences that we have and the associative values that they can conjure up, and how the two are quite related, in my opinion. So if we continue to think about what the perceptual aspects of the environment can tell us in terms of their meaning, we come to this idea of positive versus negative meanings in nature, and particularly how the environment can convey to us that it's a source of safety or whether there is a threat in the environment. And we know from research by Herzog and colleagues that the presence of danger in a natural environment can, quite logically, reduce how restorative we think that environment will be. So in their study they had natural and urban environments with a threatening looking stranger in them or without the threatening looking stranger. And in the environments where there was no stranger, the natural environments, as you might expect, were perceived to be more restorative than the urban environments. But in the presence of the stranger, this difference was eliminated. So the presence of danger in the natural environment meant that it was no longer as restorative as it had been previously, or no longer perceived to be as restorative. So we can see that danger seems to act negatively on restorative evaluations of environments. And this makes sense from a stress recovery perspective in particular. If we perceive that there is danger in the environment based on information from our senses, so what we can see or perhaps also what we can hear, then that's likely to keep us in a state of increased arousal, increased stress and alertness, and not afford us that opportunity to relax and recover from any existing stress we might have had. So danger inhibits restoration. But beyond perceiving immediate danger in an environment, the environmental properties of nature can also help us to understand whether or not a source of danger might be on the way, as well as whether it's just merely standing there in front of us like this dangerous stranger. So this links with a topic called prospect refuge. And by that I mean prospect in terms of how clearly you can see the environment around you, so you can see any potential threats or possible sources of interest coming towards you in the environment. And also refuge, so if an environment is low on refuge, then it's low on places for other individuals or predators to hide. So somewhere that is high in prospect and low in refuge is perhaps a more ideal environment. You have a clear line of sight and few places in the environment where some kind of enemy or threat can hide. And in 2013, Gattersleven and Andrews found that environments that were high on prospect and low on this negative kind of refuge were perceived to be more restorative than environments that didn't have this clear line of sight and had lots of places for potentially threatening people to hide. So they were perceived to be more restorative. And also in a laboratory setting, they were experienced as more restorative too. People were better able to recover from stress when they were viewing pictures of environments that had this prospect or clear line of sight and few opportunities for refuge of negative people or threats and stresses. They were less able to recover when environments had that kind of negative quality. So I think this shows that the sensory properties of an environment can be very much linked to what they mean to us, what they are telling us about the function these environments have. And so if that's a positive function, it seems to relate in turn to more positive restorative outcomes than if it's a negative kind of meaning or negatively evaluated in terms of threat. So here we can see the importance of this kind of top-down evaluation. The bottom-up perceptual properties are informing what we think the environment means and how we interpret it in our thoughts and our behaviour. In my ongoing work at the moment, I'm looking at people's favourite places in Finland, and something that's occurred quite a lot across the kind of data that I've been collecting is how much people in Finland like rocks, and not just any rocks, but rocks that are quite high or tall as well. So one of my participants was saying, in this forest there's a high rock where I like to climb and just sit there in silence in the middle of the forest. And this really spoke to me in terms of the prospect refuge theory as well. So this participant found this restorative place to sit where they could see what was going on around them in the middle of the forest. They were quite high up and had a good vantage point. And also it was relatively protected and of course isolated. If you're up high, there are relatively few directions from which a predator or an enemy can come and be threatening towards you. So this seemed to be an example of prospect refuge in action, in particular in Finnish favourite places. When we think about what natural environments mean to people as well in terms of positive or negative meanings, this doesn't just vary as a function of what's going on in the environment, but I think also we have to consider what is going on with the individual person experiencing the environment as well. And this comes under the category of what we call individual differences. So by that I mean personality differences or differences in the type of person that you are. What kind of demographic are you? Where do you come from? What is your culture? And what kind of work do you do? Does it have to do with nature or not? So I think one of the questions that really remains to be answered in the study of restorative environments is whether nature is actually restorative for everybody, because quite a large amount of the theoretical perspective is based on this idea that nature is a psychoevolutionary ideal for human beings, though we were our species evolved in natural environments, and this is the kind of environment or setting to which we are accustomed to being in. It's our environment in which we perform at our best. That is the kind of argument that the theoretical frameworks have developed from. But I think we also need to consider more carefully the involvement of personality as well. So whether or not someone considers themselves to be a nature or a city-built environment kind of person, whether their focus is more on the natural world or on the urban experience. And I think here the concept of connectedness to nature, as it's called in the literature, or nature-relatedness, is really very important and requires further study. So in my work on people's perceptions of birdsong in 2013, one participant in particular was stating that she wasn't really a nature kind of person, and therefore wouldn't really get much benefit from listening to bird sounds or other kinds of nature experiences if she was feeling stressed and fatigued. She would just want to be indoors in her apartment, having a built environment kind of restorative experience. Whereas other people who expressed a lot of interest in nature seemed very willing to go to nature to get those kinds of restorative experiences. So in my interviews there, even though it wasn't measured quantitatively with a questionnaire, I could see that there was this difference between people who identified as nature people and a participant who didn't. They seemed to have very different restorative experiences and evaluations of nature. And so by that I can see that perhaps nature-relatedness might be what we call an antecedent of restoration. So that is how connected you feel to nature might go on to inform the benefits you think you're going to get in natural environments. But this is perhaps not such a clear-cut area. So Mayer in France, who developed a connectedness to nature scale in 2008, they identified that when people are exposed to natural environments, their levels of connectedness to nature increase after that, and they argue that that increase in connectedness to nature arises as a consequence of experiencing nature and then goes on to inform any kind of restorative benefits that people might achieve from experiencing the natural environment. So we can see almost this kind of chicken and egg situation. Which comes first? Is connectedness to nature a driver for people to go into nature, or does spending time in nature increase relatedness to nature as a consequence of being in nature? And it might be that it works both way round as well. So people have an existing level of connectedness to nature, which might then be reinforced by repeated time spent in natural environments. And Craig and colleagues earlier this year argued that this is a topic that needs further investigation, particularly in the context of what kinds of restorative benefits can be gained in natural environments and for whom, and by how much these kind of restorative benefits can vary. So I think really now the time is right for us to spend more time studying the extent to which different personality traits like nature relatedness or connectedness to nature can help to inform the benefits that people go on to receive after experiencing nature. And as part of this, I think it's not just personality that we need to consider, but also the cultural and the contextual factors. So a good example of this is a recent study by Collado and colleagues, and they were looking at the differences in children's experiences of nature as restorative. So they were looking at a group of children who helped their parents in an agricultural context, and a different group of children who experienced the environment purely as recreation. So they weren't helping their parents do work on the land, they were just enjoying it and having fun. And what Collado and colleagues found is that children who had that recreational experience were experiencing more being away or escape in the natural environment, and also more restorative benefits and perceptions than children who were doing work and helping out on the land. And I think also that makes intuitive sense because of this idea of nature being a source of escape for people. If that same natural environment is tied up with the act of doing work and everyday labour, then of course going to that environment is not going to give you a sense of being away, because you are in the same everyday work-related environment that you are used to being in. So I think we have to be careful about generalising nature as always being a source of restoration, always being this rural idyll that people can escape to get away from their everyday hassles, because sometimes for some groups of the population that natural setting might be the very place in which their everyday hassles are occurring. So I think we need to have a nuanced view and make sure that restorative environments are tailored to provide the kind of experiences that people want and need according to their personality and their cultural and demographic context as well. So as we continue to think about the importance of the individual in restorative environments and how they interpret the environment that they're experiencing, we start to think more about what personal stories and associations individuals bring, the memories they bring to their understanding of the environment they're in as well. And so I mentioned before the work of Proust and his talk about the associations drawn between the smell and taste of a cake and the experiences in his life and his childhood. And in recent years, researchers have started to draw out the importance of these associations with the past and with past experiences, and the roles they might play in our understanding of restorative environments too. And this is something that stems back to stress recovery theory in the 80s, so Ulrich's work in 1983, talking about the role that childhood memories, associations with poems, ideas recalled from these past experiences as well. I'll put the quote on the slide here. But it so happens that this kind of association or associative value has not been explored in great depth within stress recovery theory. It's been hypothesized, but very little research has been done on the role that these memories might play in informing how restorative people find different environments. But we have noted a number of researchers calling for more research in this area. So Jules Pretty and colleagues over the last decade has highlighted the fact that we don't really know what people's restorative experiences of places that they're attached to or consider personally important might be, as opposed to the generic kind of environments that participants are exposed to in laboratory experiments. And I found something similar in my work in 2013 regarding birdsong. So when people were talking about the calls of different kinds of birds, they were often reflecting on birds they might have heard in their childhood or in a particular place, or a bird that reminded them of someone important or a particular time in their life. So when people reflect on restorative environments, often they are drawing on past experiences to inform the way they talk about, for example, nature as a whole. And these evaluations of memories are ideas that have been drawn out in greater depth by the researcher Igor Nez. So he's done some writing and research on memories of place and how we evaluate these memories of place and how it impacts on the way we evaluate the place itself. Although this hasn't been linked explicitly to restorative environments, I think this work provides a really good foundation to draw on. So thinking about the way in which we access memories, the way in which memories inform the kinds of places that we'd like to visit and revisit again and again, developing a stronger bond with places, this idea of place attachment. And this comes back again and again in the idea of favourite places. So if we consider a favourite place to be a place that's very special to us, one which we're emotionally bonded with and have a sense of place attachment, one that is more important than all others, we can see that these are places that are likely to have memories attached to them because of the repeated visits and the history and continuity that people have with a favourite place. It has mattered to them since they first discovered it, and it's likely that people have visited this place at least once in the past, so it's somewhere that they know and have associations and recollections of. And in his work, Calabi has discussed these concepts of continuity and self-identity. So by having or visiting a place, a favourite place, to which memories are attached, when one visits that place and again revisits the memories that are contained within the place, it reinforces people's sense of continuity in themselves and their self-identity. I am a person that has a past, and this past is contained within this favourite place. And he hypothesizes that this kind of continuity and reinforcement of one's identity could help people to regulate their emotions. It's a form of self-regulation if they might be feeling negative or feeling stressed. It's a place where they can go to collect a resource or access a resource that helps them to feel more like themselves again. So I think here are a lot of similar concepts to those that are laid out in theories of attention restoration and stress recovery. The idea that people can draw something from the environment to aid them in times of stress or negativity. But these kinds of concepts, the ideas of memory and of place attachment and of continuity of the self in relation to places, they're very much a product of interactions between the person and the place itself. This idea of top-down processing, drawing and interpreting on what is perceived bottom-up from one's senses, drawing from the world around us. So I think it's these kind of top-down aspects that require a lot more research and a lot more synthesis with what we already know about restorative environments in order for us to fully understand how people in their individuality experience restoration, particularly in nature. And added to that, I just wanted to mention this idea of how evaluations and experiences of restorative environments can change over time. Because very often in the experimental studies that I've discussed, students are used as a convenient sample to understand how nature can have restorative effects on people. But what we're really lacking is a body of longitudinal studies. So by that I mean studies that look at changes in people's relationship with restorative environments over time. I think this is important because very often, and I'm finding this in my work as well at the moment, when people reflect on memories of, say, favourite places, they are talking about places that mattered to them from their childhood or other times when they were feeling happy and at peace. So I think it's important for us to understand how people's perceptions of favourite places might be informed by their early years and how that might change through the course of one's adult life. We know from studies of relationships with people's gardens, for example, that when young people go through adolescence, they perhaps have less affinity with natural environments, or at least those natural environments are not appreciated simply for their natural value, but the kinds of opportunities they afford, particularly in the area of sports and recreation. Whereas as people become older, it seems like it's the nature and the interaction with natural environments itself that makes them valuable to people. So, for example, through gardening and through possession of a garden, having one's own territory. So I think it's these kind of longitudinal and contextual values, particularly relating to the individual and the lifespan, that are important for us to explore now in greater depth. And I think particularly in an applied sense, we have a lot to learn from understanding, as I mentioned previously, understanding and exploring things like healing gardens, environments designed to help people in the real world. And maybe we need to use those more as academics to understand exactly for whom restorative environments like nature can be so beneficial, and what it is about the associations with these environments that is driving or contributing to actual restorative processes. So I want to end this lecture by making a few concluding comments and maybe offering some thoughts for future research and for future applied outputs based on these kinds of research topics. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this lecture has kind of been a study of two halves. So I focused firstly on bottom-up experiences of nature as a restorative environment. And by that I mean how we perceive nature with our senses, what we see, hear, smell and touch in nature. And also how these perceptual properties are structured, so the aesthetic properties of nature. What does it look like? Does it have pattern? Is it a complex environment? How is it structured? What do we see? And I think I've highlighted the fact that vision is one of the most predominant sensory aspects of nature that's been studied so far, and to a lesser extent sound. And we know that vision and some sounds can have restorative effects on people, and particularly restorative perception. So people perceive these aspects of nature to be restorative, particularly if they're expected and congruent with each other and make sense to people. But as for senses like smell and touch, there's really rather little empirical evidence about the restorative effects that these have on people. So I really think that that's an area that we need to research further, and perhaps we need to do so together with people who are designing restorative environments. They need to be included in these kind of virtual experiences of nature, or we need to understand more about how we can include them in these kinds of technologies to see if they can offer restorative value to people. But as I mentioned as well, I think perhaps we need to be careful about the desirability of these kinds of properties as well. We want to make sure that we're not intruding on people's restorative experiences, but instead offering them a relaxation or restoration exercise that they want and they find pleasant. In the second part of my lecture, I talked about top-down processing, so the thoughts and expectations and evaluations that people bring when they experience nature, the active role of the person in or perceiving nature. How do they interpret it? And I think on the one hand, this top-down processing is very much informed by bottom-up experiences. So we perceive a natural environment, we collect that information, and then we interpret it according to what we already know. And I think the main example of that would be the idea of a safe natural environment versus a threatening one. So we're taking information about the environment and processing it according to what it means to us, our possibilities for survival, and whether this is a place that we can relax in or not. And of course that then influences how restorative we find that place. But one area I think that's really crying out for a lot more research is the study of individual differences in terms of how restorative different people find nature. Because for so long we've proceeded in this theoretical framework that implies that nature is equally good for everybody. But increasingly we're seeing that, particularly in qualitative work, not everybody expresses those same positive views of nature. And I think that's something we need to take into account in the theory as well. There needs to be scope for personality differences. And indeed, of course, differences in demographics as well. As we've seen, not everyone finds the same natural environment restorative all of the time, depending on their context with it. Is it your workplace or is it a place for recreation? Is it a place you associate with something that is away from your daily life, or is it a part of the daily life that you want to escape? So I think that's also quite important. We have to take into consideration not just who people are, but what they're doing in the context of the natural environment as well. And I think also the time is right for us to focus a little more on people's past relationships with nature, not just how they're experiencing it here and now, but also how they have experienced those natural environments in the past. Is this natural environment a place that they have a historical relationship with? Are they very attached to it? How does this impact the restorative perceptions and outcomes that they receive there? So I think these factors of individual differences are very important, and maybe need to be taken into context in applied settings as well. How can we create virtual restorative environments or other kinds of restoration interventions that use people's aspects of their past to enhance restorative experiences? Can people reflect on their childhood memories or some other positive memory of nature? Can the power of the past be harnessed and brought into the present to give an extra dimension to people's restorative experiences in nature over and above what they are perceiving with their senses? Can we use the past and memories of the past as a tool to better help people recover from stress and negative experiences? So I hope this lecture has been useful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email address is on the next slide. And of course, I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have in our question and answer session over the internet. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to chatting with you soon. Bye-bye.